On a cold February morning in 2004, in the small Minnesota town of Shakopee, a young woman named Dru Sjodin vanished without a trace. She was last seen leaving her job at the Victoria's Secret store in the Columbia Mall in Grand Forks, North Dakota, just across the state border. Her car remained in the parking lot. Her purse was found nearby, its contents scattered across the asphalt. And in the days that followed, as temperatures plummeted and snow began to fall, one question consumed everyone who knew her, everyone who searched for her, everyone who waited by the phone for news. Where was Dru Sjodin? Shakopee sits along the Minnesota River, about 20 miles southwest of Minneapolis. In 2004, it was a town caught between two identities. There were the old farming families who had worked the land for generations, their barns weathered to silver gray, their silos standing like sentinels against the flat horizon. And there were the newer subdivisions sprouting up like mushrooms after rain, filled with young couples commuting to the Twin Cities for work, their homes painted in cheerful colors that seemed almost defiant against the long Minnesota winters. Main Street still had its hardware store where farmers gathered on Saturday mornings to discuss corn futures and complain about the weather. It still had its diner where the coffee was always hot and the pie was always homemade. But the strip malls on the highway were spreading outward, year by year, acre by acre, bringing chain restaurants and big box stores that lit up the night sky with their neon signs. The Sjodin family had roots in the region that went back decades. They were the kind of family that people spoke of with respect, the kind who showed up to church potlucks and volunteered at the school fundraisers and shoveled their elderly neighbors' driveways without being asked. Dru Sjodin was 22 years old in the fall of 2003. She was a senior at the University of North Dakota in Grand Forks, majoring in graphic arts with a minor in photography. She stood 5 feet 3 inches tall, with long blonde hair that she often wore pulled back in a ponytail when she was working or studying. She had blue eyes that her father said reminded him of the Minnesota lakes in summer. She had a smile that her friends described as infectious, the kind that made strangers smile back without knowing why. Dru was responsible in the way that oldest daughters often are. She called her mother every Sunday evening, even during finals week when she barely had time to sleep. She worked part-time at the Victoria's Secret in the Columbia Mall to help pay for school, refusing to take more money from her parents than absolutely necessary. She had plans. After graduation, she wanted to move to Minneapolis or maybe Chicago, somewhere with art galleries and design firms where she could build a portfolio and make a name for herself. She talked about opening her own studio someday. She talked about traveling to Europe to study the masters. She talked about the future as though it was a certainty, as though all she had to do was reach out and grasp it. Clears throat. On Saturday, November 22, 2003, Dru worked the closing shift at the mall. It was the weekend before Thanksgiving, and the stores were busy with early holiday shoppers hunting for deals, their arms loaded with bags, their faces flushed from the heated stores and the cold outside. The weather forecast called for snow later that evening, the first real accumulation of the season. When Dru arrived for her shift at 2 in the afternoon, the sky was still that peculiar shade of gray that comes before the first real winter storm, like a bruise spreading across the horizon. The temperature hovered around 28 degrees. Wind gusted from the north, carrying with it the metallic smell of coming snow. She had complained to her roommate that morning about having to work the closing shift. She wanted to get an early start on the drive home to Shakopee for Thanksgiving break. Her mother was making her favorite dishes, sweet potato casserole with the marshmallow topping and the green bean casserole that Dru had loved since childhood. Her younger brother would be home from his first semester at college. It was supposed to be a reunion, a celebration. But the shift at the mall paid time and a half for weekend hours, and Dru needed the money. So she pulled on her black jacket, kissed her roommate goodbye, and drove the familiar route to the Columbia Mall, her radio playing the pop songs she loved, her mind already planning what she would pack for the trip home. Her shift ended at 9. Security footage from inside the mall, grainy and time-stamped in white digital numbers at the bottom of the frame, showed Dru leaving the store at approximately 9:05. She wore her black jacket zipped up against the cold that would greet her in the parking lot. She carried her purse over her shoulder, a brown leather bag that her grandmother had given her for her 21st birthday. She walked through the mall corridor toward the parking lot exit, her steps quick and purposeful, the walk of someone eager to get home after a long shift. The footage showed her pushing through the glass doors, a blast of cold air rushing in as the doors opened. And then she disappeared from view, stepping out into the November night, into the vast darkness of the parking lot where streetlights cast pools of yellow illumination that did not quite reach all the way to where cars sat in neat rows. At 9:45, a mall security officer named Dennis Kruger was making his final rounds of the evening. He walked through the parking lot, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air, checking for any remaining vehicles, any signs of trouble. He noticed a red Mazda sedan still parked in the lot, sitting alone in a section that should have been empty by now. The engine was off. The windows were dark. He walked closer, his footsteps crunching on the pavement where ice had already begun to form in the dropping temperature. The doors were locked. He shined his flashlight through the window and saw nothing unusual inside. But then, as he walked around to the driver's side, his flashlight beam caught something on the ground. A black wallet lay on the pavement near the driver's side door. Kruger bent down and picked it up. Inside the wallet was a driver's license with the photo of a young blonde woman. The name on the license read Dru Sjodin. He looked at the car again, then at the wallet, and felt the first stirrings of unease. He radioed dispatch. Within minutes, he found more. Dru's purse, approximately 50 feet from her vehicle, lying on its side near a light post. The contents had been dumped out, scattered in a rough circle around the bag itself. Lipstick, receipts, loose change, a pack of gum, all lying on the cold pavement. One of her shoes, a brown leather boot with a low heel, lay on its side near a drainage grate. The other was nowhere to be found. Kruger's unease turned to alarm. He radioed dispatch again, his voice tight. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. Within 30 minutes, Grand Forks police arrived at the scene. Officers cordoned off the area with yellow tape that snapped and crackled in the wind. They photographed the wallet, the purse, the scattered contents, the single boot. They knocked on car windows throughout the parking lot, checking for anyone who might have seen something, anyone who might still be loading packages or warming up their vehicles. A few stragglers remained, shoppers who had lingered over dinner at the mall food court or who had browsed the bookstore until closing. No one had noticed anything unusual. No screams, no struggle, no vehicle speeding away, no young woman in distress. Clear's throat. By 11:30, Detective Sarah Martinez arrived at the scene. She was a 15-year veteran of the Grand Forks Police Department, a woman with sharp eyes and sharper instincts. She walked the perimeter of the taped-off area, her hands in her pockets, her breath steaming in the cold. She studied the position of the car. She studied the scattered belongings. She studied the single boot lying on the pavement. And she felt a cold weight settle in her stomach, the feeling she always got when a case was going to be bad, when the missing person was not going to be found safe and sound, when the outcome was already written but not yet revealed. By midnight, Dru's roommate, a young woman named Jennifer Walsh, had called her parents in Shakopee. Linda and Alan Sjodin answered the phone to news that would fracture their lives into before and after. Their daughter had not come home from work. Her car was found abandoned in the mall parking lot. Her belongings were scattered on the ground. Her keys were missing. Her cell phone was missing. Dru herself was missing. And no one, not the police, not the security guards, not the witnesses who had been at the mall that evening, no one knew where she had gone or what had happened in those moments after she pushed through the glass doors and walked out into the November darkness. Linda Sjodin's knees buckled. She sank onto the couch, the phone pressed to her ear, listening to Jennifer's voice crack with fear and confusion. Alan stood beside her, watching his wife's face drain of color, knowing before she even spoke that something terrible had happened. When she finally hung up the phone, the silence in the house was absolute. The kind of silence that comes before the storm, before the screaming and the tears and the desperate phone calls and the sleepless nights and the endless waiting. They left for Grand Forks within the hour, throwing clothes into a suitcase, calling their son, calling relatives, their hands shaking, their minds unable to process what was happening. The 2-hour drive felt like an eternity. Every set of headlights on the highway made Linda's heart leap, thinking somehow Dru would be in one of those cars, that this was all a misunderstanding, that their daughter would call any moment and explain everything. But the phone stayed silent. The highway stretched on through the darkness. And by the time they arrived at the police station in Grand Forks, the search for their daughter had already begun. Part 2. The Investigation. The search began before dawn on November 23. The temperature had dropped to 18 degrees. 3 inches of snow had fallen during the night, covering the parking lot in a white blanket that obscured whatever evidence might have remained on the pavement. Grand Forks Police Department coordinated with the FBI field office in Minneapolis. North Dakota Highway Patrol dispatched units across the region, setting up checkpoints on major roads, questioning drivers who might have been in the area. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension sent investigators across the border, recognizing that if this was an abduction, state lines meant nothing to whoever had taken Dru Sjodin. Search teams spread out in concentric circles from the Columbia Mall. The first team, composed of officers and FBI agents, worked outward from the parking lot itself, searching every dumpster, every alley, every dark corner where someone might hide or discard evidence. The second team moved into the surrounding neighborhoods, knocking on doors, asking residents if they had seen anything unusual the previous night, if they had security cameras, if they had heard anything that did not fit the normal sounds of a Saturday evening. Volunteers arrived by the hundreds. Students from the university, many of whom had never met Dru but recognized her face from classes or from passing her in the hallways, showed up at the police station offering to help. Farmers from the surrounding counties arrived in pickup trucks, bringing thermoses of coffee and sandwiches wrapped in foil, ready to search fields and ditches and tree lines. People who had never been to Grand Forks before, who had only seen the news coverage, drove for hours to join the search, unable to bear the thought of a young woman vanished into the November cold. They walked in lines, arms outstretched so their fingertips nearly touched, moving slowly through fields where corn stubble poked through the snow. They searched ditches along Highway 2 and County Road 17, looking for any sign of her, any piece of clothing, any indication that she had been there. They knocked on doors in neighborhoods radiating outward from the mall, asking the same questions over and over. Had anyone seen her? Had anyone heard anything? Did anyone notice a vehicle that did not belong, a person who seemed out of place? The media descended like crows to carrion. Local news stations ran her photograph every hour, the same image taken from her university ID, her blonde hair pulled back, her smile bright and hopeful. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune sent reporters who set up outside the police station, interviewing anyone who would speak to them. The St. Paul Pioneer Press ran front-page stories. By the second day, national news outlets had picked up the story. A pretty college student. A weekend before Thanksgiving. A mystery with no answers. The elements aligned to capture attention across the country. CNN sent a satellite truck. Fox News dispatched correspondents. The story spread like wildfire, and with it came more volunteers, more tips, more theories, more noise. Clears throat. Investigators reviewed security footage from every camera in the mall. They documented Dru's movements minute by minute, creating a timeline that would be referenced again and again in the days and weeks to come. 2:05. Entering the Victoria's Secret for her shift, greeting her coworker at the register. 4:17. Helping a customer select a gift set, wrapping it in tissue paper. 7:32. Folding merchandise near the back wall, her movements efficient and practiced. 9:05. Leaving through the main corridor, her shift complete, her mind probably already on the drive home. 9:06. Pushing through the glass doors to the parking lot, the cold air hitting her face, her breath visible in the streetlight. And then nothing. Just the empty parking lot and the darkness beyond the reach of the cameras. They canvassed the parking lot for additional cameras. A bank across the street had an exterior camera, but its angle captured only the drive-through lane and a small section of the street. A gas station 2 blocks away had cameras mounted under the canopy over the pumps, but the footage was grainy and showed nothing useful, just the occasional car pulling in for fuel. The mall's exterior cameras had blind spots, gaps in coverage that seemed almost deliberate in retrospect. The area where Dru's car was parked fell into one of these shadows, a space where the cameras did not reach, where someone could do something terrible and never be recorded. Detective Martinez coordinated the evidence collection. The purse and its contents were bagged and tagged. The wallet was dusted for fingerprints. The boot was examined for any trace evidence, any fiber or hair or smudge of dirt that might tell them something. Dru's car was towed to the police impound lot where forensic technicians would spend days going over every inch of it, vacuuming the seats, testing for blood or other biological material, checking for any sign that she had been in the vehicle after leaving the mall. They found nothing. The car was clean, too clean, Martinez thought, as though Dru had vacuumed it recently, though her roommate said Dru was not particularly meticulous about her car. The backseat usually had textbooks and empty coffee cups, but now it was spotless. It meant nothing. It might mean everything. Martinez made a note. On November 24, Thanksgiving Day, while families across the country gathered around tables laden with turkey and stuffing and all the traditional dishes, the search for Dru Sjodin continued. Volunteers walked through the snow, their faces numb with cold, their fingers stiff in their gloves. The Sjodin family sat in a hotel room in Grand Forks, unable to eat, unable to sleep, staring at the television where news coverage of the search played on a loop. Linda Sjodin's sister had brought food, but it sat untouched on the table. How could they eat when Dru was out there somewhere, cold and alone and maybe hurt, maybe worse? That afternoon, a call came into the police tip line. A woman named Patricia Hernandez, who worked as a server at a restaurant called the Blue Moose on the south side of Grand Forks, said she had information. She had seen someone in the Columbia Mall parking lot on Saturday night. A man. She recognized him from the news. His name was Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. Detective Martinez took the call herself. She listened as Hernandez explained that she had driven past the mall around 9:15 on Saturday night, on her way home from her shift at the restaurant. She had noticed a man standing near a maroon sedan in the parking lot. She had not thought much of it at the time. People stand by their cars. But then she had seen his photograph on the news, part of a story about registered offenders in the area, and she was certain it was the same man. Martinez felt her pulse quicken. Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. She knew the name. Every law enforcement officer in the region knew the name. He had been released from prison earlier that year after serving time for assault and attempted abduction. He was required to register as a violent offender. He was the kind of person detectives looked at whenever something like this happened. She pulled his file. 50 years old, 6 feet tall, approximately 200 pounds, dark hair graying at the temples, mustache, multiple arrests dating back to the 1970s, assault, attempted abduction of a woman in a parking lot in 1980, attempted abduction of another woman in 1997, a pattern that made every instinct Martinez had developed over 15 years scream that this was their suspect. On November 26, 4 days after Dru vanished, FBI agents and local police knocked on the door of Rodriguez's residence in Crookston, Minnesota, a small town about 30 miles northwest of Grand Forks. It was early morning, the sun just beginning to lighten the eastern sky. The house was a small rambler with peeling paint and a chain-link fence around the yard. Rodriguez answered the door wearing sweatpants and a flannel shirt, his feet bare despite the cold. His demeanor was calm. Those who were present later described his composure as unsettling. He did not ask why they were there. He did not seem surprised to find police officers on his doorstep. He simply stood in the doorway and waited for them to speak. Agent Thomas Harding of the FBI introduced himself and asked if they could come inside. Rodriguez stepped aside without a word, allowing them to enter. The house was sparsely furnished. A couch with torn upholstery, a television on a stand, a kitchen table with 2 chairs. The air inside smelled of cigarette smoke and something else, something stale and unpleasant that Harding could not quite identify. They asked Rodriguez about his whereabouts on the evening of November 22. He sat on the couch, his hands folded in his lap, and said he had been driving around, where specifically they asked. He could not remember, just driving. Did he go to Grand Forks? Maybe. He drove around a lot. Did he go to the Columbia Mall? Maybe. He could not remember. Did he see anyone at the mall? He shrugged. Lots of people at malls. Clear's throat. His answers were maddeningly vague. He offered no specifics, no details that could be verified or disproven. He had no alibi, no receipts from gas stations or restaurants, no witnesses who could place him anywhere other than the Columbia Mall parking lot at the time Dru Sjodin disappeared. But he also did not confess. He did not break down or cry or show any emotion at all. He simply sat on his couch and answered their questions with the kind of practiced indifference that came from decades of interactions with law enforcement. They asked if they could search his vehicle. Rodriguez consented, signing the form they provided without reading it, without asking for a lawyer. The maroon sedan sat in the driveway, covered in a thin layer of frost. It was an older model, 1980s vintage, with rust eating through the wheel wells and a crack across the windshield. Forensic technicians photographed it from every angle, documenting the license plate, the body damage, the condition of the tires. They noted the mileage on the odometer, 73,412 miles. They opened the doors and began the search. In the back seat, wedged between the cushion and the seat back, they found a knife. The blade was approximately 6 inches long, the kind of knife used for hunting or fishing. The handle was wooden, worn smooth from use. There were stains on the handle that appeared to be blood, dark brown, encrusted in the grain of the wood. In the trunk, beneath a ratty blanket that smelled of motor oil, they found a length of rope, approximately 12 feet long, with frayed ends. Next to the rope was a roll of duct tape, the kind sold at any hardware store, with about half the roll remaining. On the floor, mat on the passenger side of the front seat, caught in the carpet fibers, they found strands of long blonde hair. The technicians bagged everything: the knife, the rope, the duct tape, the hair. They towed the car to the police impound lot in Grand Forks, where it would be subjected to the same exhaustive examination as Dru's Mazda. They swabbed for DNA. They tested the stains on the knife. They measured the rope and noted the type of knot tied at one end. They counted the fibers on the duct tape and compared them to databases of manufacturing patterns. Rodriguez was taken into custody for questioning, driven to the Grand Forks police station, and placed in an interview room with cinder block walls painted beige and a metal table bolted to the floor. Agent Harding and Detective Martinez sat across from him. Between them and Rodriguez was a tape recorder, its red light glowing to indicate it was capturing every word. They informed him of his rights. He nodded, indicating he understood. They asked him again about November 22. He gave the same vague answers, driving around, could not remember where. Maybe Grand Forks, maybe the mall. They showed him photographs of Dru Sjodin. Did he recognize her? He squinted at the photos, tilted his head, and said maybe. Lots of people look alike. They asked him about the knife in his car. He said he used it for fishing. The blood was from fish. They asked him about the rope. He shrugged. Everyone has rope. They asked about the duct tape. He said he used it to fix things around the house. They asked about the blonde hair. He said he gave people rides sometimes. Could have been anyone. For 6 hours they questioned him. He never asked for a lawyer. He never raised his voice. He sat with his hands folded on the table and answered their questions with a maddening calm that made Martinez want to scream. But beneath that calm, she sensed something else. Not fear exactly. More like watchfulness, as though he was waiting for them to make a mistake, to ask the wrong question or push too hard and give him an opening to walk away. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves in the hallway outside the interview room. The hair, the knife, the rope, the duct tape, the lack of alibi, the prior convictions for attempted abduction, everything pointed to Rodriguez, but they had no body. They had no witness to an actual crime. They had circumstantial evidence that pointed in one direction like an arrow, but the case was not yet complete. And without more, they could not charge him with abduction or anything worse. They held him on a parole violation, a technicality related to his failure to properly register his vehicle. It would buy them time, but not much. They needed more. They needed to find Dru. For weeks, the search continued. Helicopters flew grid patterns over farmland, their thermal cameras scanning for any heat signature that might indicate a body. Divers searched the Red River despite water temperatures near freezing, descending into the murky water in dry suits, feeling along the bottom with their gloved hands. Cadaver dogs were brought in from across the region, German shepherds and Belgian Malinois trained to detect the scent of human remains. They worked through fields and forests, along riverbanks and railroad tracks, through every abandoned barn and empty silo and forgotten farmhouse within a 100-mile radius. The snow kept falling. By mid-December, drifts reached 4 feet in some places, making the search nearly impossible. Volunteers could no longer walk through fields. Visibility was reduced to mere yards. The helicopters were grounded when the wind picked up. And still, Dru Sjodin remained missing. The media coverage began to shift. The initial urgency faded. Other stories took precedence. The holiday season brought different news. And while the search continued, while investigators kept working leads and interviewing witnesses and analyzing evidence, the public attention that had been so intense in those first days began to wane. Life moved on, as it always does, for everyone except the Sjodin family and the investigators who could not let go. Part 3: The Silence. January arrived with temperatures that plunged below zero. the kind of cold that makes the air itself seem brittle, ready to shatter like glass. The wind howled across the prairie, whipping snow into shapes that looked almost alive in the moonlight, drifts that rose and fell like waves on an ocean frozen in time. In Shakopee, the Sjodin family tried to navigate a life that no longer made sense, a life where the calendar kept advancing and the seasons kept changing, but time itself seemed to have stopped on the night of November 22. The Christmas tree sat in the corner of the living room, undecorated. Linda had bought it out of habit, driving to the lot where they had always purchased their trees, selecting a Douglas fir the way she always did. But when Alan brought it inside and set it in the stand, they both stared at it and could not bring themselves to hang the ornaments. Dru's stocking hung on the mantel, the same red felt stocking with her name stitched in white thread that had hung there every Christmas since she was born. It remained empty. Her room remained exactly as she had left it before leaving for school in August. The textbooks on her desk, spine creases from being opened and highlighted. The photographs pinned to the bulletin board, Dru with her friends at a concert, Dru at her high school graduation, Dru laughing at something just outside the frame. The jacket draped over the chair, a denim jacket with patches she had sewn on herself. Linda Sjodin stopped sleeping through the night. She would wake at 3 in the morning, jolted from dreams where Dru was calling for her, dreams where she could hear her daughter's voice but could not find her no matter how hard she searched. She would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to Alan's breathing beside her, and then she would get up and walk through the house. She checked locks. She checked windows. She looked out at the street, half expecting to see headlights, to see Dru's red Mazda pulling into the driveway. As though her daughter might somehow reappear if only the doors were left unlocked, if only she kept vigil through the darkest hours. Alan Sjodin threw himself into work. He left before dawn and returned after dark, working overtime shifts at the manufacturing plant where he had been employed for 20 years. His coworkers knew better than to ask how he was doing. They saw it in his face, the hollowness around his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged as though he was carrying a weight that would eventually crush him. Work was the only thing that gave him a sense of purpose, the only time when his mind was occupied enough that he could go minutes, sometimes even hours, without thinking about his missing daughter. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt the ground shift beneath you when facts refuse to align with what your heart insists must be true, the Sjodins' experience was a waking nightmare. They believed their daughter was alive. They had to believe it. Every morning, Linda would tell herself that today would be the day Dru was found. Every evening when the phone rang, her heart would leap with hope that this was the call, the one that would bring their daughter home. They believed it because the alternative was unthinkable, a darkness so complete that to acknowledge it would be to surrender to despair. Their son, Chris, returned to college for the spring semester, but his mind was never fully on his studies. He called home every day, sometimes twice a day, asking if there was news. His grades suffered. His friends worried. But he could not focus on anything except the empty space where his sister should have been, the absence that filled every room and every conversation. Meanwhile, Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. remained in custody, held at the Polk County Jail on the parole violation and other charges that prosecutors had managed to assemble. His public defender, a young woman named Rachel Simmons fresh out of law school, argued that the evidence was circumstantial. The hair found in his car could have come from anyone. He gave people rides. He had friends. The knife could have fish blood on it, just as he claimed. The rope and duct tape were not illegal to possess. Half the farmers in Minnesota had rope and duct tape in their vehicles. Without a body, without a witness, without a confession, the case against her client was fragile, built on suspicion and prejudice against a man who had served his time and was trying to rebuild his life. The prosecutors disagreed. The DNA testing on the blonde hair had come back. It matched Dru Sjodin. The odds of it being someone else, the forensic expert testified, were approximately 1 in 6 trillion. The blood on the knife was human blood, type O positive, the same blood type as Dru. The rope had fibers on it that were consistent with fibers found on clothing items belonging to Dru. The duct tape had adhesive residue that matched material found in Dru's purse. Clear's throat. But still, there was no body. And without a body, the case remained in a kind of legal limbo, suspended between what everyone knew in their hearts and what could be proven in court. Months passed. February brought more snow, then a brief thaw that turned the snow to slush and the slush to ice. March arrived with winds that rattled windows and tore shingles from roofs. The search for Dru Sjodin continued, but it had shifted from an active, large-scale operation to something smaller, more targeted. Investigators followed up on tips that still trickled in. They re-interviewed witnesses. They reviewed the evidence again and again, looking for something they might have missed. April came, and with it the true thaw. Snow melted in earnest, revealing the brown grass beneath, the dead leaves from the previous fall, the debris that had been hidden all winter. Farmers began preparing their fields for planting, running their tractors through the mud, turning over the soil that had been frozen solid for months. On April 17, 2004, nearly 5 months after Dru Sjodin vanished, a call came into the Polk County Sheriff's Office. A farmer named Wayne Askeruth was walking his property near Crookston, inspecting damage from the spring thaw. He owned approximately 200 acres of land, mostly given over to soybeans and corn, with sections of uncultivated land along the edges where the soil was too poor or too rocky to farm. His property bordered a ravine, a deep cut in the landscape thick with brush and scrub oak and wild plum trees that bloomed white in the spring. Askeruth was walking along the edge of this ravine, looking for places where the runoff from the thaw had caused erosion, checking fence lines that might need repair. The morning was cool but pleasant, the kind of morning that made him glad to be a farmer, to be outside working the land. As he walked, something caught his eye. A flash of color that did not belong, blue, bright against the brown and green of the ravine. He stopped, stared. The color was partially concealed by a tangle of branches and dead leaves, and the new growth of spring vegetation. He moved closer, pushing aside the branches, and there, lying in the ravine, partially covered by debris, he saw what he had hoped never to find. A body, a young woman, blonde hair, dressed in clothing that might once have been bright but was now stained and torn. He backed away, his hands shaking, and pulled out his cell phone. Part 4. The Revelation. The Polk County medical examiner arrived at the scene within an hour, driven by a sheriff's deputy whose face was grim and set. The area was immediately cordoned off, yellow tape stretched between trees, fluttering in the breeze that carried with it the smell of turned earth and new growth. Investigators arrived from Grand Forks, from the FBI field office, from the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. They photographed the site from every conceivable angle, documenting the position of the body, the surrounding vegetation, the distance from the road, the proximity to Rodriguez's residence. The body had been there for months, exposed to winter weather, to animals, to the relentless passage of time and the cycles of freezing and thawing. Identification was made through dental records, the only method reliable enough given the condition of the remains. The dental records matched. The body was Dru Sjodin. Detective Martinez stood at the edge of the ravine, looking down at the scene, and felt a mixture of emotions so complex she could not name them all. Relief that Dru had been found, grief for the young woman whose life had been stolen, rage at the person who had done this, and underneath it all, a bone-deep weariness the accumulated weight of nearly 5 months of searching and hopping and knowing, somewhere deep inside, how this would end. The Polk County Medical Examiner, Dr. Patricia Brennan, conducted the autopsy over 2 days. She worked methodically, documenting every injury, every detail that might tell the story of what had happened to Dru Sjodin in the hours after she was taken from that mall parking lot. The autopsy revealed details that would later be presented in court, details that newspapers would report in carefully sanitized language, details that the Sjodin family would hear and carry with them for the rest of their lives. Dru had suffered injuries consistent with a violent assault, blunt force trauma to the head, ligature marks on her wrists and ankles, indicating she had been bound with rope. Dr. Brennan determined that Dru had likely not survived long after her abduction, a small mercy in a case where there were few mercies to be found. The location where she was found, measured carefully by investigators using GPS equipment, was less than 3 miles from Alfonso Rodriguez Jr.'s residence in Crookston. On April 20, 2004, 3 days after Dru's body was discovered, Rodriguez was formally charged in federal court. The indictment included abduction resulting in the loss of life, aggravated assault, and other counts that carried the possibility of capital consequences under federal law. Because the crime had crossed state lines, Dru having been taken from North Dakota and her body found in Minnesota federal jurisdiction applied. The United States Attorney for the District of North Dakota would prosecute the case. The arrest made headlines across the nation, the story resurging with the same intensity it had held in those first days after Dru disappeared. Rodriguez was led into the federal courthouse in Fargo, handcuffed and wearing an orange jumpsuit, flanked by federal marshals whose faces were impassive. Photographers lined the courthouse steps, their cameras clicking rapid fire. Reporters shouted questions that Rodriguez ignored, keeping his eyes down, his face expressionless, as he had been throughout the investigation. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Those who knew Dru, friends from the university who had searched for her, community members who had followed the case, people who had never met her but felt connected to her story. They held signs with her photograph, the same smiling image that had been shown on the news for months. They wore ribbons, blue ribbons that had become a symbol of the search for Dru. They stood in silence as Rodriguez was escorted inside, some weeping openly, others simply staring, trying to reconcile the ordinary-looking man in the orange jumpsuit with the horror of what he had done. The Sjodin family released a statement through their attorney. It was brief, just a few sentences thanking law enforcement for their tireless efforts, thanking the community for their support, and asking for privacy as they began the process of laying their daughter to rest. Linda Sjodin could not bring herself to attend the court hearing. Alan went, sitting in the gallery with his hands clenched in his lap, watching as the man accused of taking his daughter's life stood before the judge and entered a plea of not guilty. The investigation continued even after the arrest. Forensic teams examined Rodriguez's car with new purpose, knowing now what they were looking for. They found additional evidence. In the trunk, beneath the carpet liner, they found more blonde hair. They found fibers that matched the fibers from Dru's jacket. They found a single fingernail, torn and broken, that DNA testing confirmed belonged to Dru. Cell phone records were subpoenaed and analyzed. Rodriguez's phone had pinged off towers in Grand Forks on the night of November 22, placing him in the area of the Columbia Mall between 9 and 9:30. His phone had then pinged off towers along Highway 2, heading west toward Crookston, between 9:30 and 10:15. The timeline fit. The evidence fit. Everything fit together like pieces of a puzzle that investigators had been assembling for 5 months. Clear's throat. Odometer readings from Rodriguez's vehicle were analyzed. When the car had been impounded on November 26, the odometer read 73,412 miles. Investigators obtained service records from an oil change Rodriguez had received on November 15, 1 week before Dru disappeared. At that time, the odometer had read 73,347 miles. The difference was 65 miles. The distance from Rodriguez's residence in Crookston to the Columbia Mall in Grand Forks and back was approximately 62 miles. The numbers were damning. Witness statements were collected and re-examined. Patricia Hernandez, the restaurant server who had called in the tip, testified that she was absolutely certain the man she saw in the mall parking lot was Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. She had seen him standing near his maroon sedan at approximately 9:15 on the night of November 22. She described what he was wearing, a dark jacket and jeans. She described his posture, how he seemed to be watching the entrance to the mall, waiting for something or someone. Another witness came forward, a college student named Brandon Kelly who had been at the mall that night. He testified that he had seen a man matching Rodriguez's description following a young blonde woman through the parking lot. He had not thought much of it at the time. People walk through parking lots. But the image had stuck with him, something about the way the man moved, purposeful but trying not to be noticed. When he saw Rodriguez's photograph on the news, he was certain it was the same person. The trial began in August 2006, nearly 3 years after Dru Sjodin disappeared. The federal courthouse in Fargo was packed. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Reporters from across the country attended, filing daily updates. Court TV broadcast portions of the trial. The Sjodin family attended every day, sitting in the front row, Linda clutching a photograph of Dru, Alan with his arm around his wife, both of them pale and drawn from the ordeal of reliving their daughter's final hours through testimony and evidence. The prosecution, led by Assistant United States Attorney Lynn Jordheim, presented their case methodically. They started with Dru's background, establishing who she was, making her real to the jury. They showed photographs of her at family gatherings, at her college graduation, living her life. They called witnesses who testified about her character, her kindness, her dreams for the future. They established that on November 22, 2003, Dru Sjodin was a young woman with everything to live for, and that someone had taken that future away from her. Then they presented the evidence. The forensic expert who testified about the DNA found in Rodriguez's car. The odds, she explained, were astronomical. The blonde hair found on the passenger side floor mat was Dru Sjodin's hair. There was no reasonable doubt. The blood on the knife was human blood, type O positive, consistent with Dru's blood type. While they could not say definitively that it was her blood, given that O positive was a common blood type, taken in context with all the other evidence, it was highly significant. The rope expert testified about the rope found in Rodriguez's trunk. She explained that fibers from that rope matched fibers found on Dru's wrists, where ligature marks indicated she had been bound. The match was not absolute, as rope fibers can be similar across manufacturing batches, but the type of rope, the color, the composition, all pointed to the same source. The cell phone expert presented records showing Rodriguez's movements on November 22. A map was displayed for the jury, showing the cell towers and the times Rodriguez's phone had connected to each one. 9:03, tower near his residence in Crookston. 9:17, tower near the Columbia Mall in Grand Forks. 9:42, tower along Highway 2 heading west. 10:11, tower back near Crookston. The jury followed the progression, seeing the pattern, understanding what it meant. Patricia Hernandez testified about seeing Rodriguez in the parking lot. She was nervous on the stand, her voice shaking slightly, but she was adamant about what she had seen. She pointed at Rodriguez, seated at the defense table between his attorneys, and said without hesitation that he was the man she saw that night. Brandon Kelly testified about seeing Rodriguez following the young blonde woman. Under cross-examination, the defense attorney pressed him about the lighting in the parking lot, about the distance he had been from the subjects, about whether he could really be certain it was Rodriguez he had seen. Kelly remained firm. He knew what he saw. He had thought about it for months before coming forward, worried that he was mistaken, but when he saw Rodriguez's face on television, he was certain. Clear's throat. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from Rodriguez himself. The prosecution played videotapes of his interviews with police and FBI agents from November 26 and the days that followed. The jury watched as Rodriguez, seated in the interview room, admitted he had been at the Columbia Mall on the night of November 22. They heard him say he might have seen a young woman in the parking lot. They watched as he shifted in his seat, as his eyes moved from the investigators to the door and back again, as he offered explanations that contradicted each other from one sentence to the next. In one interview, he said he had been driving around because he could not sleep. In another, he said he had gone to the mall to buy cigarettes, though there was no record of any purchase. In yet another interview, he admitted he had noticed the blonde woman leaving the store, admitted he had watched her walk to her car. And then, when pressed about what happened next, he said he left, just drove away. But the timeline did not support that. The cell phone records did not support that. The witness statements did not support that. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial. Attorney Rachel Simmons, now with several years of experience under her belt, presented character witnesses who testified that Rodriguez had been trying to rehabilitate himself after his release from prison. His parole officer testified that Rodriguez had been compliant with all requirements, attending meetings, checking in regularly, following the rules. Neighbors testified that he was quiet, kept to himself, never caused any trouble. Simmons suggested alternative theories. Perhaps someone else had abducted Dru and coincidentally disposed of her body near Rodriguez's property. Perhaps the blonde hair in his car came from one of the many people he gave rides to, and through an extraordinary coincidence, one of those people had hair that matched Dru's DNA profile. Perhaps the witnesses were mistaken in their identifications, influenced by media coverage and the pressure to solve a high-profile case. But the accumulation of details, the small pieces that fit together like a jigsaw puzzle assembled over months and years, was overwhelming. The DNA, the cell phone records, the odometer readings, the witness statements, the rope, the knife, the duct tape, the location of the body, each piece alone might have been explained away. But together they formed a picture that was impossible to ignore. The prosecution called Dr. Brennan, the medical examiner, to testify about the autopsy. She explained in clinical language what had happened to Dru Sjodin, the injuries she had sustained, the manner in which she had passed. The courtroom was silent as she spoke, jurors leaning forward, some with tears in their eyes. Linda Sjodin left the courtroom, unable to listen. Alan remained, his jaw clenched, forcing himself to hear every word, to bear witness to what his daughter had endured. The defense chose not to call Rodriguez to testify. It was a strategic decision. Simmons knew that putting him on the stand would open him up to cross-examination, would allow the prosecution to ask about his prior convictions, about his history of attempted abductions, about the details of those cases that bore striking similarities to what had happened to Dru Sjodin. Better to let the case rest on the argument that the prosecution had not met their burden of proof. Closing arguments lasted 2 days. The prosecution went first, summarizing the evidence, walking the jury through the timeline, connecting each piece of evidence to the narrative of what had happened on November 22. Lynn Jordheim stood before the jury and said that while they might wish for a smoking gun, for a confession, for absolute certainty. The law did not require that. The law required proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And when you looked at all the evidence together, when you considered the DNA and the cell phone records and the witnesses and the defendant's own statements, there was no reasonable doubt that Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. had abducted and taken the life of Dru Sjodin. The defense countered that circumstantial evidence, no matter how much of it there was, still required speculation and inference. They argued that the prosecution wanted the jury to connect dots, but that connecting dots was not the same as proof. They argued that Rodriguez's prior convictions were being used to prejudice the jury, to make them see him as guilty simply because he had committed crimes in the past. They asked the jury to set aside emotion and sympathy and consider only the evidence. And when considered objectively, the evidence did not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Rodriguez was guilty. The jury deliberated for 2 days. During that time, the Sjodin family waited in a small room adjacent to the courtroom. They did not speak much. There was nothing left to say. They had lived through the worst imaginable nightmare, and now they waited to see if there would be any measure of justice for their daughter. On September 22, 2006, the jury sent word that they had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled within minutes. The judge took the bench. The jury filed in, their faces solemn. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman who taught mathematics at a local high school, stood when asked if they had reached a verdict. She said they had. The clerk asked her to read it. Guilty on all counts. Rodriguez sat motionless as the verdict was read. His face showed no emotion, no surprise, no fear, nothing. He simply stared straight ahead as though listening to something far away, something that did not concern him. The Sjodin family, seated in the front row of the gallery, held each other and wept. Linda buried her face in Alan's shoulder. Alan's eyes were closed, tears streaming down his face, his hand clutching the photograph of Dru that Linda had carried with her every day of the trial. Around them, people who had followed the case, who had searched for Dru, who had never met her but had come to care about her through the months of coverage, also wept. The bailiffs, hardened men and women who had seen countless trials, wiped at their eyes. The sentencing phase took place several months later. It was a separate proceeding, required by federal law in cases where the ultimate consequence was being sought. The prosecution presented aggravating factors: the brutality of the crime, the suffering Dru had endured, the impact on her family and community. They called Linda and Alan Sjodin to testify about the void left in their lives, the daughter they would never see graduate, never see marry, never see become a mother herself. The defense presented mitigating factors: Rodriguez's difficult childhood, his history of substance use, mental health issues that had never been properly treated. They argued that while he had committed a terrible crime, taking his life would not bring Dru back, would not heal the family's pain, would serve no purpose except vengeance. The jury deliberated again. This time it took 3 days. When they returned, they recommended the harshest available sentence. The judge, bound by the jury's recommendation under federal guidelines, sentenced Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. to face capital consequences for his actions, a sentence that reflected the gravity of what he had done and the life he had taken. Media coverage of the verdict and sentencing was extensive. National news outlets ran stories about the case, about Dru Sjodin's family, about the long search for justice that had finally reached its conclusion. Editorials discussed the broader implications, the failures in the system that had allowed a violent offender with a history of attempted abductions to be released and to commit this crime. Lawmakers cited the case when advocating for stricter monitoring of violent offenders, for longer sentences, for databases that would track such individuals more carefully. In 2006, partly in response to Dru's case, federal legislation was introduced. The Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act included provisions that became known informally as Dru's Law, requiring more stringent registration and monitoring of violent offenders, particularly those with histories of offenses against women and children. Dru's name became attached to this legislation, her story a catalyst for change, a reminder of why such laws were necessary. Those who believed in Rodriguez's innocence, and there were a few, pointed to what they saw as gaps in the evidence, to the lack of eyewitnesses to the actual abduction, to the possibility, however remote, that the jury had gotten it wrong. They wrote letters to newspapers. They created websites arguing for his innocence. But they were a small minority, voices lost in the overwhelming consensus that justice had been served. In Shakopee, the Sjodin family tried to move forward, though they knew that moving forward was not the same as moving on, that there was no moving on from the loss of a child. They established the Dru Sjodin National Center for Missing Persons, a foundation dedicated to victim advocacy and support for families of the missing. Linda became a speaker, traveling to conferences and schools, sharing their story, talking about the importance of awareness and vigilance and supporting families going through similar ordeals. Alan remained more private, preferring to work behind the scenes, helping with the foundation's logistics, managing the fundraising, doing the work that needed to be done without being in the spotlight. He still went to work at the manufacturing plant. He still came home to the house on the quiet street lined with maple trees. He still walked past Dru's room, which had been turned into an office for the foundation, but which still held her photographs on the walls. They spoke at vigils held on the anniversary of Dru's disappearance. They attended events honoring her memory. They met with other families who had lost loved ones to violence, sharing their experience, offering what comfort they could, knowing that sometimes the only thing that helped was knowing you were not alone in your grief. The house where Dru grew up still stands on that quiet street. The maple trees are taller now, their branches reaching across the road to touch each other, forming a canopy of green in summer and a tunnel of gold in autumn. Linda and Alan still live there. They still remember the day she disappeared, November 22, 2003, a date burned into their memories with the permanence of a scar. They still carry the weight of those months of not knowing, the agony of waiting, the moment when hope finally died and was replaced by the terrible certainty of loss. But they also carry something else now, a sense that Dru's story mattered, that her life mattered, that by sharing their experience, by advocating for change, by supporting other families, they were honoring their daughter's memory in a way that transcended the horror of how she died. They were keeping her alive through their work, through the foundation that bore her name, through the lives that were saved because of the laws passed in her memory. Closing. The case of Dru Sjodin is a reminder that some questions take years to answer, that the path to justice is rarely straight, that the truth, when it finally emerges, can be both devastating and redemptive. It is a reminder that evil exists, sometimes in the most ordinary-looking packages, and that vigilance is not paranoia but wisdom. Dru Sjodin was 22 years old when she vanished from a mall parking lot on a cold November night in 2003. She wanted to finish college. She wanted to build a career as a graphic designer. She wanted to travel and fall in love and have children and grow old. She wanted to live. Her story became a catalyst for change, a name that lawmakers invoked when arguing for stronger protections, a face that reminded people why we must never become complacent about the safety of those we love. The swing hung still in the playground where Dru once played as a child. The toy truck lay on its side in her parents' garage, a relic from a childhood that seemed impossibly distant now. The photographs on the wall smiled out at visitors to the foundation office, frozen in moments of joy that would never come again. But in those photographs, Dru lives. In the work of the foundation, she lives. In the laws passed in her name, she lives. And in the memory of all who knew her and all who came to know her story, she lives still. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.